The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned city of New Haven, its golden rays illuminating the skeletal remains of what had once been humanity's greatest achievement. Kalen Thorne crouched behind the rusted hull of an overturned bus, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from rebar and kitchen knives. Through the gaps in the metal, he watched the shambling forms of the undead as they moved through the streets like a slow-moving tide of decay and hunger. 3 months had passed since the outbreak began, 3 months since the world had collapsed into this nightmare of rotting flesh and endless screaming. The official reports had called it a viral outbreak, but Kalen knew better. He had seen the bodies rise from morgues that should have kept them still, had watched his own neighbors claw their way out of fresh graves. This was something beyond science, something that defied every natural law he had ever known. A soft whistle echoed from the building behind him, and Kalen turned to see Zara Volkov's pale face peering through a broken window. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her green eyes held the same haunted quality that marked all survivors. She had been a trauma surgeon before the world ended, her steady hands saving lives in operating rooms. Now those same hands wielded modified surgical instruments as weapons, cutting through undead flesh with clinical precision. "They're moving toward the harbor district," Zara whispered, her Russian accent barely detectable after years in America. "Isidore says the migration patterns suggest they're following some kind of pheromone trail." Kalen nodded grimly. Isidore Blackwood had been a professor of biology at the local university, a man whose thick beard and gentle demeanor had made him popular among students. Now his knowledge of decomposition and biological processes had become their most valuable asset in understanding their enemies. If Isidore believed the undead were being drawn somewhere specific, then they needed to pay attention. Inside the abandoned department store that served as their temporary refuge, the remaining survivors of New Haven gathered around a collection of camping equipment and salvaged supplies. Narita Chin sat hunched over a microscope she had rescued from a medical facility, her delicate features creased with concentration as she studied samples of infected tissue. Her background in pathology had given them insights into the virus, though what she had discovered offered little hope. Thaddeus Grimm stood near the barricaded entrance, his military bearing evident despite the civilian clothes he now wore. The former Marine sergeant had taken charge of their defense, organizing patrol schedules and weapon maintenance with the same efficiency he had once applied to battlefield logistics. His steel-gray eyes constantly scanned for threats, and his calloused hands never strayed far from the assault rifle slung across his shoulder. Young Lysander Vale sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully sharpening a collection of knives and arrows. At barely 19 he had been studying philosophy when the world ended, his mind full of abstract theories about human nature and morality. The apocalypse had given him practical lessons in both, transforming the scholarly youth into a deadly scout whose slight frame allowed him to move unseen through the urban wasteland. Cordelia Ashworth emerged from the store's back rooms, her arms laden with canned goods and medical supplies. She had managed a logistics company before the outbreak, coordinating supply chains across 3 states. Now she applied those organizational skills to keeping their small group fed and equipped, turning their refuge into a model of efficient resource management despite the impossible circumstances. "We have maybe 2 weeks of food left," Cordelia announced, setting down her burden with practiced efficiency. "The pharmacy supplies are running low too, especially antibiotics and painkillers. If we're going to make a move, it needs to be soon." Isidore looked up from the map he had been studying, his weathered face grave. "The migration patterns are accelerating. I estimate we have perhaps 40,000 of them moving through the city now, all heading toward the old industrial complex near the waterfront. If my calculations are correct, they'll be concentrated there within the next 72 hours. "Concentrated how?" Thaddeus asked, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "Think of it as a gathering," Isidore replied, his voice heavy with foreboding. "Something is calling them, drawing them together. Every specimen I've observed shows the same behavioral modification. They're no longer just wandering aimlessly. They have purpose now, direction. And that makes them far more dangerous than anything we've faced before." The group fell silent, each member processing the implications of Isidore's words. Outside, the wind carried the distant moans of the undead, a sound that had become the soundtrack to their daily existence. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, thick and suffocating. Kalen watched as each member of their small group processed Isidore's words, seeing his own fears reflected in their faces. 40,000 undead, gathering with purpose rather than wandering aimlessly, it changed everything about their survival strategy. Narita finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been tracking the cellular degradation in the specimens we've collected. The virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue anymore. It's evolving, becoming more sophisticated. The neural pathways in newer infections show signs of coordination, almost like a primitive collective consciousness. She gestured toward her makeshift laboratory, where glass slides and tissue samples were arranged with scientific precision. 3 weeks ago, the infected showed no response to coordinated stimuli. Now they're exhibiting pack behavior, communication through pheromone releases, even basic problem-solving skills. They're learning. Thaddeus slammed his fist against the wall, the sound echoing through their refuge. You're telling me these things are getting smarter? That they're organizing themselves into some kind of army? It appears that way, Isidore confirmed, his scholarly calm masking the terror in his eyes. The concentration at the industrial complex isn't random. They're being summoned, gathered for a purpose we don't yet understand. But given the timing and the numbers involved, I suspect we're looking at a coordinated assault on the remaining human settlements. Lysander looked up from his weapons, his young face pale but determined. How many other survivor groups are left in the region? Cordelia consulted her handwritten notes, records she had been keeping of radio transmissions and supply runs. We've had contact with maybe 6 other groups in the past month. The largest has about 30 people holed up in the old hospital complex. The smallest is just a family of 4 hiding in a farmhouse outside town. Total, we're looking at maybe 150 people scattered across a 30-mile radius. Against 40,000, Zara said quietly, the mathematical impossibility of their situation hanging heavy between them. Kalen stood and walked to the window, peering through the makeshift curtains at the empty streets below. A lone zombie shambled past, its decomposing face turned upward as if sensing his presence. The thing that had once been a middle-aged woman in a business suit now wore the blank expression of eternal hunger, its dead eyes reflecting no trace of the person it had once been. We can't run anymore, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of leadership he had never asked for. We've been moving from shelter to shelter for months, always staying one step ahead. But if they're organizing, if they're becoming more intelligent, then hiding isn't an option. They'll hunt us down systematically. Thaddeus nodded grimly. The kid's right. We've got maybe 72 hours before they finish gathering. After that, they'll spread out again, but this time with purpose. They'll sweep through every building, every hiding place, until they've eliminated every last human in the region. So what are you suggesting? Cordelia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. We hit them first, Kalen replied, turning back to face the group. While they're concentrated, before they can spread out and hunt us down piecemeal. We gather every survivor we can reach, pool our resources and weapons, and make a stand. Narita shook her head vigorously. That's suicide. Even if we could somehow contact and coordinate with all the other groups, we'd still be outnumbered 200 to 1. It's mathematically impossible. Maybe, Isidore said thoughtfully, stroking his beard. But there might be another way. The industrial complex where they're gathering, it's built on unstable ground. The whole area was originally marshland, filled in during the 1940s. The foundations of those buildings are supported by a network of underground supports and drainage systems. Thaddeus's eyes lit up with understanding. You're talking about bringing the whole place down on top of them. The logistics would be complex, Isidore continued, warming to his subject. We'd need significant amounts of explosives, precise timing, and a way to ensure maximum structural damage. But theoretically, yes. If we could collapse the main buildings while the majority of the horde is concentrated inside. It would be like dropping a mountain on them, Lysander finished, his philosophical mind grasping the brutal poetry of the plan. Zara was already thinking practically. We'd need to get close enough to plant the charges, which means fighting our way through whatever perimeter they've established. And we'd need to time it perfectly, too early and we only get a fraction of them, too late and they start spreading out again. There's something else, Cordelia added quietly. The radio chatter I've been monitoring suggests that other cities are experiencing similar gatherings. This isn't just happening here. If we fail, if this is some kind of coordinated assault on all human settlements, She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood that they might be fighting not just for their own lives, but for the survival of the human species itself. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant moaning, a sound that seemed to grow stronger and more organized with each passing hour. The abandoned radio station on Elm Street had once broadcast morning traffic reports and top 40 hits to the citizens of New Haven. Now its transmission tower served as a beacon for the desperate, carrying Kalen's voice across the wasteland to every survivor group within range. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, knowing that each word might be heard by both friend and foe. This is Kalen Thorne broadcasting from downtown New Haven. We have confirmed intelligence about a massive undead concentration building at the Old Meridian Industrial Complex. Estimated numbers exceed 40,000 and growing. All survivor groups in the region need to respond immediately. We're organizing a coordinated strike before they disperse. This may be our only chance. The radio crackled with static for several long minutes before responses began filtering in. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the hospital group was first, her voice tight with exhaustion. Thorne, this is Vasquez. We've got 28 people here, including 6 children. Half our adults are injured or sick. I don't know how much help we can provide in an assault. Thaddeus leaned toward the microphone. Doctor, this is Sergeant Grimm. We're not asking everyone to be frontline fighters. We need medical support, supply coordination, and safe zones for non-combatants. Can you establish a field hospital at a secure location? Understood, Sergeant. We can set up at the old elementary school on Riverside Drive. It's defensible and has good sight lines. We'll be ready to receive casualties. More voices joined the conversation over the next hour. Marcus Ironside, a former construction foreman leading 8 survivors in the warehouse district, confirmed he could provide demolition expertise and access to industrial equipment. The Chin family, no relation to Narita, reported from their farmhouse that they had been stockpiling ammunition and could serve as a resupply point. Most significantly, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Stormwind answered from the National Guard Armory, her military precision cutting through the static. Thorne, I've got 14 Guard members and access to serious ordnance. We've been maintaining radio silence to avoid attracting attention, but if this is as big as you're saying, we need to act. I can provide squad-level coordination and heavy weapons support. As the plan took shape over the airwaves, Lysander worked frantically to sketch out tactical positions and approach routes on a large map spread across a table. His philosophical training had given him an unexpected talent for strategic thinking, able to see patterns and connections that others might miss. The industrial complex has 3 main access points, he explained to the group. The north gate leads directly to the largest warehouses where the bulk of the horde will likely concentrate. The east entrance provides access to the administrative buildings and offers good overwatch positions. The south approach is the most exposed but leads to the utility infrastructure. Isidore nodded approvingly. If we're going to bring down the buildings, we'll need to access the utility tunnels that run beneath the complex. The structural supports are concentrated there, along with the main electrical and gas lines. A coordinated series of explosions could create a cascading failure. Zara had been studying medical texts and field manuals, preparing for the casualties they would inevitably face. We need to assume heavy losses, she said grimly. Even if everything goes perfectly, we're talking about close-quarters combat against impossible odds. I've been reviewing trauma protocols and emergency amputation procedures. We're going to need every medical professional we can find. Narita looked up from her microscope, where she had been studying fresh tissue samples. There's something else we need to consider. My analysis suggests that the virus responds to stress hormones and adrenaline. When the infected become agitated or threatened, their physical capabilities increase significantly. They become faster, stronger, more aggressive. If we attack while they're concentrated, we might trigger a response that makes them exponentially more dangerous. You mean they'll go into some kind of berserker state? Cordelia asked, her logistics training making her constantly calculate risks and resource requirements. Something like that. The cellular changes are remarkable. Increased muscle tension, enhanced neural firing rates, reduced sensitivity to pain and damage. It's like the virus has found a way to overclock the human body, pushing it beyond normal biological limits. Thaddeus absorbed this information with military stoicism. So we'll be fighting super zombies. Good to know. Changes the ammunition requirements and engagement protocols, but doesn't change the fundamental plan. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we bring down those buildings before they can fully respond. As evening fell, the various survivor groups began moving toward their assigned positions. The plan was ambitious to the point of fantasy. A coordinated assault by fewer than 200 survivors against a horde that outnumbered them by hundreds to one. But as Kalen watched the last of the sunset fade behind the skeletal remains of the city skyline, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. The radio crackled one final time before they powered down for the night. It was the voice of Sarah Nightingale, an elderly librarian who had been maintaining a small group of survivors in the public library. Her words were simple but carried the weight of their shared desperation. For what it's worth, you're all brave as hell. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least we're not going quietly into that dark night. Good luck to all of you. In the distance, the sound of the gathering horde had grown noticeably louder, a constant low moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Dawn broke gray and cold over New Haven, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain before the day was through. Kalen stood on the roof of their temporary headquarters, watching as the various survivor groups moved into position around the industrial complex. Through binoculars, he could see the scale of what they were facing: thousands upon thousands of undead packed into the sprawling network of warehouses and factories, their collective moaning creating a sound like distant thunder. The plan they had crafted over the radio seemed impossibly optimistic in the harsh light of morning. 3 separate assault teams would approach from different directions, with Marcus Ironside's demolition crew responsible for reaching the underground utility systems, while Lieutenant Colonel Stormwind's guard unit provided heavy weapons support from elevated positions. The medical teams under Dr. Vasquez had established their field hospital in the fortified elementary school, ready to receive the wounded, though everyone understood that for many, there would be no coming back. Zara emerged onto the roof carrying 2 cups of coffee brewed from their dwindling supplies, her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. She handed Kalen one of the cups and stood beside him, studying the distant complex where their fate would be decided. Narita finished her analysis of the viral samples early this morning, she said quietly. The results aren't encouraging. The infection has mutated beyond anything we initially understood. The latest specimens show signs of genetic material that doesn't match any known terrestrial virus. It's almost as if... As if what? Kalen prompted, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. As if it's not entirely of this world. The protein structures are too complex, too perfectly designed for their function. Narita thinks we might be dealing with something that was artificially created, possibly as a biological weapon that somehow got out of control. The implications hung between them like a physical weight. If the virus was engineered, then somewhere there might be people who understood it well enough to create a cure, or to weaponize it further. But that knowledge did nothing to help them with their immediate situation. Below them, Lysander and Cordelia were making final preparations for the assault teams. The young philosopher had traded his books for body armor and automatic weapons, his transformation from scholar to warrior a testament to humanity's capacity for adaptation under extreme circumstances. Cordelia moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing complex supply chains, ensuring that each team had the equipment and ammunition they would need for what might be their final battle. Thaddeus's voice crackled through their radio headsets, reporting from his position overlooking the complex's main entrance. Surveillance shows increased activity among the targets. They're not wandering randomly anymore. There's definite organization to their movements. Looks like they're arranging themselves into some kind of formation. Isidore's response came from the south approach, where he was leading a team of volunteers toward the utility access points. Confirmed from here as well. The concentration patterns suggest they're preparing for coordinated movement. If my calculations are correct, they'll begin dispersing within the next 6 to 8 hours. This is our window. The weight of timing pressed down on everyone involved. Too early, and they would face the full fury of the concentrated horde. Too late, and the undead would spread out across the region, making it impossible to eliminate them in a single coordinated strike. They had perhaps a 4-hour window to infiltrate the complex, plant the charges, and trigger the structural collapse that would bring down the entire facility. Lieutenant Colonel Stormwind's voice cut through the radio chatter with military precision. All teams, this is Stormwind. Weather reports indicate heavy rain starting within 2 hours. That will provide cover for our approach but will also make movement more difficult. Recommend we begin the operation immediately. Kalen looked at Zara, seeing his own fears reflected in her green eyes. They had known each other for only 3 months, but the shared trauma of the apocalypse had created bonds deeper than those forged over years of normal life. In her face he saw not just his partner in survival, but the closest thing to family he had left in the world. Whatever happens down there, he said quietly, I want you to know that meeting you was the only good thing to come out of this nightmare. She reached out and squeezed his hand, her surgeon's fingers steady despite the circumstances. We're going to get through this, Kalen. We're going to find a way to rebuild, to make something better from the ashes of what we've lost. The radio crackled again as Marcus Ironside reported from the demolition team. Charges are in position at the primary structural points. We've got enough explosive power to bring down half the complex, but we need to ensure maximum concentration of targets before detonation. Estimate 30 minutes to complete placement of remaining charges. As if responding to some unseen signal, the moaning from the industrial complex suddenly increased in volume and intensity. Through his binoculars, Kalen could see the undead beginning to move with greater purpose, their shambling gait becoming more coordinated and directed. They know we're here, Zara whispered, voicing what they all understood. The final battle for humanity's survival was about to begin. The first raindrops began to fall as Kalen's assault team approached the industrial complex's north entrance, the cold water mixing with perspiration born of fear and determination. Through the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, he could see the undead massed in numbers that defied comprehension, a sea of rotting flesh and gnashing teeth that stretched across the entire facility. The plan had seemed logical when discussed over radio transmissions and sketched on paper maps. Now, faced with the reality of 40,000 infected beings gathered in one location, the sheer audacity of their mission became starkly apparent. They were 57 survivors, armed with salvaged weapons and improvised explosives, preparing to assault what amounted to the largest concentration of undead ever recorded. Thaddeus moved with practiced military efficiency, his squad of 8 volunteers following his lead as they approached the fence line. The former Marine had painted his face with mud and charcoal, transforming himself into something that belonged in this new world of death and decay. His assault rifle was loaded with special ammunition that Marcus Ironside had modified, each bullet containing a small explosive charge designed to cause maximum tissue damage. Breaching charges in position, Thaddeus whispered into his headset. Detonation in 10 seconds. The explosion tore through the fence with a sound like thunder, immediately drawing the attention of hundreds of undead. But instead of the mindless rush they had expected, the infected moved with disturbing coordination. Groups of 10 to 15 zombies began advancing in formations that resembled military tactics, their movements guided by some collective intelligence that chilled the survivors to their bones. Lysander's team was responsible for clearing a path to the main warehouse where the bulk of the horde was concentrated. The young philosopher-turned-warrior moved with surprising grace through the maze of industrial equipment and abandoned vehicles, his modified crossbow sending steel-tipped bolts through the skulls of approaching undead with mechanical precision. Philosophy taught me that death is just another state of being, he called out to his teammates as he reloaded. But I never imagined I'd be responsible for so many transitions. Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled through the radio from the field hospital, where she was already receiving the first casualties of the assault. We've got 3 incoming with severe bite wounds. The infection rate appears to be accelerating. I'm seeing full zombification in under 20 minutes instead of the usual 2 to 3 hours. Zara fought her way through a group of infected office workers, her modified surgical instruments finding vital points with deadly accuracy. Each zombie she destroyed had once been someone's colleague, friend, or family member, but she had learned to see past their former humanity to the disease that had consumed them. The rain was falling harder now, turning the industrial complex into a treacherous maze of slippery metal and pooling water. But it also provided cover, muffling the sounds of their approach and making it harder for the undead to coordinate their responses. Isidore's demolition team had reached the utility tunnels beneath the complex, where they found a scene that defied explanation. The underground areas were filled with infected who showed signs of advanced decomposition. Some had been dead for months, yet they moved with the same purpose as the recently turned. More disturbing still, they had been arranging themselves in patterns that resembled some kind of primitive writing system. My God, Isidore whispered as he photographed the scene with a waterproof camera. They're not just gathering. They're trying to communicate something. These symbols, these arrangements, it's like they're preparing for something beyond our understanding. Marcus Ironside's construction expertise proved invaluable as they placed explosives at key structural points throughout the underground network. His weathered hands worked with the confidence of someone who had spent decades understanding how buildings lived and died. The beauty of controlled demolition, he explained to his team as they wired the charges, is that you're not just destroying something. You're choreographing its collapse, making sure it falls exactly where and when you want it to. Above ground, Lieutenant Colonel Stormwind's guard unit had established overwatch positions on the surrounding buildings, their heavy weapons providing covering fire for the assault teams below. But even their military-grade equipment seemed inadequate against the sheer numbers they faced. Target concentration in Building 7 is beyond our initial estimates, Stormwind reported, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the chaos around her. I'm seeing coordinated movement patterns that suggest leadership hierarchy among the infected. Some of them are directing others, giving what appears to be tactical commands. The revelation that the Undead had developed military organization sent shock waves through the assault teams. They had prepared to fight a mob of mindless cannibals, not an army with strategy and leadership. Cordelia's supply teams were struggling to maintain ammunition flow to the frontline fighters, the demand far exceeding their most pessimistic projections. We're burning through ammo at 3 times the projected rate, she reported from her coordination point. At this consumption level, we've got maybe 40 minutes before we're down to melee weapons only. As Kalen's team fought their way deeper into the complex, they began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. The Undead weren't just gathering randomly, they were preparing for a coordinated assault on every remaining human settlement in the region. The industrial complex had become a staging area for the final elimination of their species. The sound of approaching helicopters suddenly cut through the rain and gunfire, and Kalen looked up to see military aircraft approaching from the east. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps other survivors or even government forces coming to provide support. Then the helicopters opened fire, not on the Undead but on the survivor teams below. The machine gun fire from the helicopters tore through the assault teams with devastating precision, forcing survivors to take cover behind concrete barriers and abandoned machinery. Kalen pressed himself against a rusted shipping container as bullets sparked off the metal inches from his head, his mind struggling to process this unexpected betrayal. All teams fall back to secondary positions. Thaddeus's voice roared through the radio, his military training taking over even as his worldview shattered. We've got hostile aircraft, unknown operators, engaging all ground personnel indiscriminately. Through the chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Stormwind's voice cut through with cold fury. Those are not military aircraft. The markings are civilian contractors, but the equipment is military grade. Someone's been planning this operation for a long time. The implications hit them like physical blows. The virus outbreak, the gathering of the Undead, even their own desperate plan to assault the complex. It had all been orchestrated by someone with resources far beyond what any surviving government could muster. They weren't just fighting for survival, they had walked directly into a trap. Zara dove behind a concrete pillar as another burst of gunfire swept across their position. Her medical training allowed her to quickly assess the casualties among their group. 3 dead, 7 wounded, and more falling with each passing minute. The precision of the attack suggested that whoever was in those helicopters had been monitoring their communications and knew exactly where each team would be positioned. This was planned from the beginning, she called out to Kalen, her voice barely audible over the sound of rotors and gunfire. The virus, the gathering, all of it. We're not fighting a natural disaster, we're being exterminated. Isidore's team in the underground tunnels found themselves in the unexpected position of being the only group not under direct fire. His scholarly mind raced through the possibilities as he continued to study the strange symbols and patterns left by the infected. The arrangements down here aren't random, he reported through the radio. They're coordinates, geographic locations marked in a primitive symbolic language. Each symbol cluster corresponds to a human settlement, and they're arranged in the order of planned attacks. The revelation that the Undead had been programmed with specific targets sent chills through the remaining survivors. This wasn't just about eliminating the population of New Haven, it was part of a coordinated global campaign to wipe out humanity entirely. Marcus Ironside, trapped near the main demolition charges, made a decision that would haunt the survivors forever. The gruff construction foreman had always been a man of few words, but his voice came through the radio with absolute clarity. The charges are ready, but someone needs to stay behind to ensure proper detonation timing. The helicopters are jamming our remote triggers, so it has to be done manually. Marcus, no, Cordelia's voice cracked with emotion. We can find another way. We can. There is no other way, sweetheart. You all need to get clear. I'll give you 5 minutes, then I'm bringing this whole place down on top of these bastards. Lysander's philosophical training had prepared him to contemplate death in abstract terms, but watching a friend choose to sacrifice himself for the greater good brought those concepts into sharp, painful focus. The young man who had once debated the nature of heroism in ancient texts now witnessed it firsthand. The evacuation began immediately, with teams fighting their way toward the perimeter while Marcus held his position near the explosives. The helicopters continued their assault, but the pilots seemed to realize what was about to happen and began pulling back to a safe distance. Dr. Vasquez's medical team worked frantically to evacuate the wounded from their field hospital, loading unconscious patients into whatever vehicles they could find. The elderly doctor moved with the determination of someone who had spent her entire career fighting death, unwilling to give up on any patient who still drew breath. As the minutes ticked away, Narita made a discovery that changed everything. In her mobile laboratory, she had been analyzing tissue samples taken from the most recently infected zombies, and the results defied everything they thought they knew about the virus. "The infection isn't natural," she announced through the radio, her voice tight with scientific excitement and horror. "It's artificial, but not in the way we thought. The genetic markers suggest extraterrestrial origin. This virus was designed by a non-human intelligence." The revelation that they were facing an alien weapon rather than a human-engineered bioweapon added another layer of impossibility to their situation. The helicopters, the coordinated attack, the systematic elimination of humanity, it was all part of a plan conceived by minds that operated according to entirely different logic. With 30 seconds remaining before detonation, Marcus's voice came through the radio one final time. "Tell everyone that it's been an honor. And tell them that what we're doing here matters. Even if we don't make it out, even if this is the end, we didn't go quietly." The explosion, when it came, was visible from miles away. The entire industrial complex collapsed in a carefully choreographed sequence of destruction, taking with it the 40,000 undead that had been gathered there. The helicopters were caught in the blast radius, their burning wreckage falling into the debris like metallic stars. In the aftermath, as the survivors regrouped and counted their losses, they realized that Marcus's sacrifice had done more than eliminate a massive concentration of undead. It had also destroyed whatever command and control infrastructure had been coordinating the global extermination campaign. But the cost had been terrible, and the questions that remained were even more frightening than the answers they had found. 6 months after the destruction of the Meridian Industrial Complex, Kalen stood at the edge of what had once been New Haven's bustling downtown district. The crater where the facility had stood stretched nearly a mile across, its edges still scorched black from the massive explosion that had ended Marcus Ironside's life and saved what remained of humanity. The scattered survivor groups had come together in the aftermath, forming a new community built around the shared trauma of their impossible victory. They called it Haven's Rest, a settlement that grew from the ashes of the old world with the hard-won wisdom of those who had faced extinction and somehow managed to step back from the brink. Zara emerged from the medical center she had established in a converted shopping mall, her surgeon's hands now permanently stained with the dirt of construction work and the blood of countless patients she had saved. The partnership between her and Kalen had evolved into something deeper than survival necessity, a love forged in the crucible of the apocalypse, tempered by loss and strengthened by hope. "Narita finished her analysis of the samples we recovered from the blast site," Zara reported, settling beside him on the bench they had built from salvaged materials. "The results are complicated." The scientist had become something of a legend among the survivors, her discovery of the virus's extraterrestrial origin having explained so much about the coordinated nature of the outbreak. But with that knowledge came implications that kept them all awake at night, staring at the stars with new suspicion. "She found traces of technology in the deepest parts of the crater," Zara continued. "Not human technology. Equipment that operates on principles we don't understand, using materials that don't exist in our periodic table. Whatever sent the virus to Earth, they left monitoring equipment behind." Isidore approached from the direction of the library he had established in an old bookstore, his arms full of handwritten journals and carefully preserved books. The former professor had become their unofficial historian, documenting not just the events of the outbreak but also the knowledge and skills that would be needed to rebuild civilization. "The radio telescopes at the university are picking up unusual signals," he announced, his scholarly excitement tempered by years of hard-won caution. "Patterns that suggest intelligent origin, but not from any known terrestrial source. It's possible that our victory here has attracted attention from elsewhere." The implication hung between them like a gathering storm cloud. They had won a battle, not a war. Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the intelligence that had engineered the virus was receiving reports about the failure of their extermination campaign. Lysander had traded his weapons for carpentry tools, but his philosophical nature remained unchanged. He worked nearby, constructing new housing for the steady stream of survivors who continued to arrive at Haven's Rest from other regions. The young man who had once debated the nature of heroism now lived it daily, building homes for the homeless and hope for the hopeless. I've been thinking about Marcus's last words, he said, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his forehead. He said that what we were doing mattered even if it was the end. But it wasn't the end, was it? It was a beginning. Dr. Vasquez emerged from the school where she now taught children born after the outbreak. Kids who would grow up in a world where zombies were bedtime stories and alien invasions were historical facts. The elderly physician had become their most treasured resource, her knowledge of medicine and her gentle wisdom guiding them through the challenges of creating a new society. We have 37 children under the age of 5 now, she reported with quiet pride. They're learning to read, to count, to understand that the world can be rebuilt rather than just survived in. Whatever threats we might face in the future, they'll be better prepared than we were. Cordelia had transformed her logistics expertise into something resembling municipal government, coordinating trade with other survivor settlements and managing the complex task of distributing resources fairly among their growing population. Her efficiency had helped establish Haven's Rest as a regional hub for recovery efforts. We've made contact with settlements as far east as Chicago and as far west as Denver, she announced, consulting the hand-drawn maps that had replaced GPS systems. The coordination network that Marcus destroyed was apparently global in scope. Settlements worldwide are reporting similar victories over concentrated undead populations. Thaddeus had established a training program for the settlement's defenders, teaching former accountants and teachers how to handle weapons and coordinate tactical responses. The former Marine sergeant understood that their victory had been temporary. Whatever intelligence had launched the initial assault would undoubtedly try again, and next time they needed to be ready. As evening fell over Haven's Rest, the survivors gathered for their weekly memorial service, remembering those they had lost and celebrating those they had saved. Marcus Ironside's name headed a long list of heroes who had given their lives to ensure that humanity had a future, but his sacrifice had become symbolic of something larger, the willingness to pay any price for the survival of hope itself. Kalen looked up at the stars, their light somehow both beautiful and threatening in the new world they had created. Somewhere among those distant points of light, alien minds were planning their next move in a war that humanity was only beginning to understand. But tonight, in this small settlement built from the ruins of the old world, children were laughing and lovers were holding hands and people were making plans for tomorrow. Marcus Ironside had been right, what they had done mattered. They had refused to go quietly into the dark night, and in that refusal, they had found something worth preserving. The last stand of humanity had become its first step toward a future none of them could yet imagine, but all of them were determined to build together.